July 18, 1944. A hedgerow field 3 miles south of St. Lo, Normandy. Staff Sergeant Robert Kline pressed himself against the earthen embankment, feeling the thump of German MG-42 fire stitching the hedgerow above his head. His platoon was pinned, machine guns firing from 3 directions, open field behind them, no cover ahead. The radio operator beside him was dead, the SCR-300 radio smashed by the same burst that killed him. No way to call for artillery, no tanks within miles. Standard doctrine said hold position and wait for support. Kline looked at his 60mm mortar team crouched in the ditch. 6 high-explosive rounds remaining. 3 smoke shells. Smoke was for coordinated assaults, artillery missions, armor advances, not small unit retreats. Using it without coordination violated field doctrine. He ordered the mortar team to fire smoke shells in a zigzag pattern across the open field to their left, the direction no one was retreating. The mortarmen hesitated. Kline repeated the order. 3 shells impacted in irregular intervals, creating shifting white clouds that looked like something moving under concealment. German machine gun fire redirected toward the smoke. Kline heard shouting in German, repositioning, adjusting fields of fire to cover the phantom threat. Move now! Use the ditch line! What happened next in that Norman hedgerow field, and in dozens of similar engagements across the Bocage, would become one of those unofficial tactical innovations that spread from company to company through whispered battlefield lessons. The realization that American soldiers didn't need to follow doctrine when improvisation could save lives, and that sometimes the best weapon wasn't firepower, but the enemy's own assumptions about what the smoke meant. The Normandy hedgerows had already killed thousands of American soldiers in fighting that reduced infantry combat to brutal, close-range ambushes, where official doctrine often failed. But what happened in that field south of St. Louis proved that American initiative and the willingness to break rules could turn tactical disasters into survival stories that doctrine manuals would later quietly incorporate as improvisational smoke tactics under fire. The first man moved at 07:34 hours. Private First Class James Donnelly rolled from his position against the hedgerow embankment and dropped into the drainage ditch. The water was ankle-deep and cold. Behind him, German MG-42 fire continued its distinctive ripping canvas sound, but the bursts were tracking left toward the smoke clouds drifting across the open field. Staff Sergeant Kline counted seconds. The smoke had to hold long enough for over 100 men to move 200 yards through exposed terrain. If German gunners realized the deception before the platoon reached cover, the ditch would become a killing zone with nowhere to hide. The 3 smoke shells had impacted in irregular intervals across the field to the platoon's left, 15 yards apart, creating discrete white clouds that didn't connect into a continuous screen. To Kline's men, the pattern looked random. To German defenders trained to recognize American tactical signatures, it looked like something else entirely. Wehrmacht defensive doctrine taught soldiers that coordinated smoke screens preceded armor-supported assaults. Static smoke indicated artillery preparation. Moving smoke, clouds appearing sequentially in irregular patterns, suggested armored vehicles maneuvering under concealment, each cloud marking a tank's position as it advanced. The 60mm mortar shells Kline's team had fired created exactly that signature. German squad leaders shouted orders. Machine gun fire redirected. Kline heard the unmistakable sound of German troops repositioning. Boots on stone, equipment rattling, voices calling coordinates. They were concentrating defensive fire toward the phantom threat, preparing to engage American armor that didn't exist. The platoon moved in groups of 8, 1 fire team at a time, keeping interval to prevent bunching. Donnelly reached a culvert 30 yards down the ditch and held position, covering the next group's movement. Behind him, Corporal Martinez led his squad into the water. The ditch snaked along the field's edge, following the natural drainage pattern Norman farmers had maintained for centuries. It offered concealment but minimal cover. If Germans spotted the movement and redirected fire, the ditch's confined space would concentrate casualties. Kline watched the smoke. The white clouds drifted slowly eastward in the light morning breeze, dissipating gradually. The deception had maybe 2 minutes left before the smoke thinned enough for German observers to realize no American armor was advancing through the field. 2 minutes to move 100 men 200 yards, while German machine guns were within earshot. Sergeant Frank Morrison's squad reached the halfway point, a thicker section of hedgerow that offered brief hard cover. Morrison signaled back. No casualties yet. Kline felt tension ease slightly. The improvisation was working. German defenders had followed their doctrine, interpreting the smoke through training that assumed American forces wouldn't waste limited ammunition on feints. But doctrine worked both ways. Kline had violated U.S. Army regulations by using smoke without coordination, authorization, or proper command oversight. Field Manual 2385 was explicit. Smoke munitions were restricted to coordinated missions. Small unit commanders didn't have authority to employ smoke for tactical deception. What he'd done could be grounds for court-martial if officers chose to enforce the letter of regulation. The last fire team, Lieutenant Harrison and the radio operators who'd survived when their SCR-300 was destroyed, moved through the ditch at 0742. 8 minutes since the first man moved, German fire still tracked toward the dissipating smoke clouds. Donnelly signaled from the far hedgerow. All elements reached safety. Kline counted heads as soldiers crawled up the embankment into cover. 114 men in the platoon when the ambush started. He counted 111 reaching the hedgerow. 3 casualties during the escape. 2 wounded, 1 killed by German fire that hadn't quite been fooled by the smoke. Against the 20 or 30 casualties they'd have taken in a conventional retreat under fire, the improvisation had saved dozens of lives. Lieutenant Harrison pulled himself over the embankment, muddy water streaming from his uniform. He looked at Kline for a long moment. The lieutenant had heard the smoke order. He'd seen Kline violate doctrine to execute a deception unauthorized by any field manual, and he'd watched that violation save most of his platoon. "We'll discuss this back at battalion," Harrison said quietly. The words could mean anything: commendation or court-martial, official recognition or official punishment. Within hours, soldiers from other companies would hear what happened in the field south of St. Lo. They'd hear how a sergeant used smoke shells to fool German defenders into thinking American tanks were attacking. They'd hear how over 100 men escaped a killing zone because one leader violated doctrine when official procedures would have meant death. The story would spread through the informal networks that connected frontline units. Whispered conversations in foxholes, shared experiences during brief rear area rotations, tactical lessons passed from sergeant to sergeant without official documentation. And officers at battalion and regimental level would face an uncomfortable question. Should they punish the violation or learn from its success? The Norman bocage was older than any nation fighting in World War II. Centuries of French agriculture had created the landscape. Thousands of small, irregular fields, separated by earthen embankments 4 to 6 feet high, topped with dense hedgerows of hawthorn, oak, and elm. The hedges served practical purposes: property boundaries, water retention, livestock containment, and sources of firewood and fruit from apple and pear trees growing along them. In 1944, those ancient agricultural walls became fortresses. Each hedgerow created a natural defensive position. The earthen embankments were thick enough to stop small arms fire and provide cover from artillery. The vegetation on top, averaging 5 meters tall in 1944 with brambles and nettles forming impenetrable tangles at ground level, provided concealment and observation posts. Between the hedgerows, open fields measured anywhere from 20 yards to several hundred yards across. For German defenders, the bocage was ideal terrain. Wehrmacht forces had occupied Normandy for 4 years, conducting maneuvers and learning to exploit every tactical advantage the landscape offered. They positioned machine guns in hedgerow corners where fields of fire converged, on narrow approaches. They established observation posts in the tallest vegetation, often concreted positions like Tobruks with pre-calculated artillery coordinates for every likely enemy approach. They avoided cutting hedges near defensive positions, maintaining natural concealment. For American attackers, the bocage was nightmare terrain that nullified every advantage they possessed. A platoon leader needed to accomplish 3 objectives: see, shoot, and maneuver. The hedgerows made all 3 nearly impossible. Visibility was measured in yards rather than hundreds of meters. An enemy machine gun position could be 10 yards away, but completely invisible behind dense vegetation. American infantry couldn't see threats until they were already under fire. Shooting required line of sight the terrain denied. American weapons had effective ranges of several hundred yards, M1 Garands out to 500 yards, machine guns beyond that. But in the bocage, engagements happened at ranges where soldiers could hear enemies breathing on the other side of a hedgerow, but couldn't see them to shoot. Artillery and air support struggled to provide effective fire without hitting friendly forces in the maze-like terrain. Maneuvering was even worse. Standard infantry tactics emphasized flanking movements and fire and maneuver, but the bocage compartmentalized the battlefield into isolated boxes. Each field was a separate kill zone with limited entry and exit points, narrow gaps in hedgerows, sunken lanes between embankments, or gates that funneled soldiers into obvious approach routes. German defenders knew every entrance. American attackers discovered them by walking into machine gun fire. The Combat Studies Institute's analysis documented the tactical nightmare. It only took a few German defensive positions to pin down an entire infantry battalion and hold up an attack for long periods. Each hedgerow became a fortress that required assault under fire across open ground. Soldiers couldn't flank because adjacent fields were separated by more hedgerows. They couldn't suppress defenders who remained invisible until opening fire at point-blank range. American tanks, which should have provided mobile firepower and protection, became liabilities in the bocage. The hedgerow embankments were too steep and thick for standard tanks to cross. Attempting to climb them exposed vulnerable belly armor to German anti-tank weapons. Tanks that stayed on roads became trapped in sunken lanes, narrow passages between earthen walls where a single disabled vehicle blocked the entire column. On June 15, 1944, a German ambush demonstrated the terrain's lethality. An American armored unit supporting the 30th Infantry Division moved south from Omaha Beach with tanks on paved roads and infantry on flanks. Within moments, German forces destroyed the lead tanks, blocking the road. The entire column sat trapped in a sunken lane, unable to maneuver, unable to see attackers, taking casualties from orbis, enemies firing from concealment yards away. The Americans took hours to extract themselves from a kill box that German defenders had prepared weeks earlier. General Omar Bradley called the bocage the damnedest country I've seen. General J. Lawton Collins of 7 Corps, who had fought through jungle warfare on Guadalcanal, said the bocage was as bad as anything he'd encountered in the Pacific. But Guadalcanal prepared him for jungle fighting. Nothing in American training prepared soldiers for the bocage. The adaptation cost lives. 2 months after D-Day, 1st U.S. Army had suffered 100,000 casualties, 85% among infantry units. The casualty rate wasn't sustainable. Units that landed in Normandy in June were combat ineffective by August, depleted by weeks of grinding hedgerow-to-hedgerow combat that consumed soldiers faster than replacements arrived. American forces eventually developed solutions. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division invented the Rhino hedgerow cutter, steel teeth welded to tank fronts that allowed them to punch through embankments rather than climb over them. Tactics evolved to emphasize combined arms, infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support working together to assault each field systematically. But the adaptation took weeks and cost thousands of casualties. The bocage revealed how terrain could negate technological advantages. American artillery outranged German guns. American air power dominated the skies. American armor outnumbered German tanks. But in the close quarters maze of the bocage, those advantages meant less than knowing the terrain, having prepared positions, and forcing attackers to cross killing zones under fire from invisible defenders. Within this nightmare, American soldiers improvised survival tactics that doctrine never anticipated. They learned to use bazookas to blow gaps in hedgerows rather than assaulting through gates. They developed techniques for suppressing one hedgerow while assaulting the next. And some, like Staff Sergeant Kline, discovered that improvisation and deception could accomplish what firepower alone couldn't achieve, escaping ambushes by exploiting enemy assumptions rather than trying to outshoot prepared defenses. The innovation spread through informal channels, sergeant to sergeant, company to company, faster than official doctrine could adapt. Survival depended on learning from soldiers who'd already fought through similar situations and lived to share lessons. The bocage fighting created culture where junior leaders' tactical innovations mattered more than following procedures written by officers who'd never experienced the terrain's unique brutality. U.S. Army Field Manual 2385, governing employment of the 60mm mortar M2, was explicit about smoke shell usage. The manual carried by every mortar squad leader in Normandy dedicated an entire section to smoke munitions and their authorized applications. Smoke shells were authorized for three specific purposes: obscuring enemy observation during friendly movement, screening large unit operations such as river crossings or amphibious assaults, and marking targets for artillery or airstrikes. The manual emphasized that smoke employment required coordination with higher headquarters. Small unit commanders, platoon leaders, and company commanders were not authorized to employ smoke for tactical deception without approval from battalion or higher. The doctrine made sense in theory. Smoke was limited resource. Each mortar carried only a fraction of smoke rounds compared to high explosive shells. Wasting smoke on unauthorized missions meant potentially lacking it when properly coordinated operations required screening. Moreover, uncoordinated smoke could obscure friendly observation, interfere with adjacent units' operations, or reveal American positions to enemy artillery observers. The Field Artillery Journal in July 1944 warned explicitly about improper smoke use. Be careful when using smoke in a fight, or you'll obscure the target for yourself and for the other people who are firing in the area. The guidance reflected hard-learned lessons from North Africa and Italy, where uncoordinated smoke had blinded friendly forces more than enemies. But the doctrine assumed conditions that didn't exist in the Normandy bocage. Field Manual 23-85 assumed reliable communications between small units and higher headquarters. In the hedgerows, radios failed constantly. The SCR 300 backpack radio that platoons relied on for battalion communication had effective range of 1 to 3 miles under ideal conditions. The bocage's terrain, earthen embankments, dense vegetation, and irregular topology reduced that range dramatically. Platoons moved through terrain where they couldn't communicate with company headquarters 2 hedgerows away. The doctrine assumed coordinated command structures where battalion staff could evaluate smoke requests and authorize employment within minutes. But in hedgerow fighting, battalions often lost contact with forward companies for hours. Company commanders didn't know where their own platoons were, much less coordinate smoke employment across multiple units. The tactical situation changed minute by minute as squads encountered ambushes, cleared fields, or became pinned by fire from invisible positions. Most critically, the doctrine assumed battlefield conditions that allowed time for proper planning and approval. Wait for authorization. Coordinate with adjacent units. Ensure smoke wouldn't interfere with other operations. In the bocage, waiting for approval often meant waiting to die. Platoons pinned by German machine gun fire didn't have minutes for coordination. They had seconds to react before casualties mounted beyond sustainability. Lieutenant Colonel Wesley Yale, writing after-action analysis for 2nd Infantry Division in August 1944, identified the gap. Existing doctrine for smoke employment presumes conditions of visibility, communication, and coordination that do not exist in bocage terrain. Small unit leaders faced with immediate tactical crises cannot wait for battalion approval to employ available resources. But acknowledging the problem didn't automatically change doctrine. The U.S. Army's process for updating field manuals required months of review, committee analysis, and approval through multiple command levels. Combat experience in July 1944 might inform doctrine revisions published in 1945. Far too late to help soldiers fighting in Normandy that summer. Experienced officers recognized the disconnect. They understood that rigid adherence to doctrine in situations where doctrine didn't apply would cost lives unnecessarily. But they also understood that armies functioned through discipline and standardized procedures. If every sergeant could ignore doctrine whenever he judged it inappropriate, military organization would collapse into chaos. The tension created impossible situations for junior leaders. Follow doctrine and watch your men die because you waited for authorization that never came. Or violate doctrine, save your men, and face potential court-martial for unauthorized actions. Staff Sergeant Kline had chosen to violate doctrine. His smoke employment was unauthorized, uncoordinated, and used limited ammunition for purposes the manual explicitly didn't cover. By the letter of FM 23-85, he had committed an offense subject to military justice. But his violation had saved over 100 men. The Army's institutional response to such situations revealed something fundamental about American military culture. Unlike Wehrmacht forces, where deviation from orders typically resulted in severe punishment, or Red Army forces, where unauthorized initiative could mean execution, American forces granted junior leaders latitude to adapt when circumstances demanded it. The principle was articulated in Army doctrine, but rarely discussed explicitly. Initiative was valued over rigid compliance when battlefield conditions made following standard procedures counterproductive. Officers were expected to exercise judgment about when doctrine applied and when it didn't. Sergeants who demonstrated sound tactical judgment earned trust to make decisions colonels couldn't make from battalion headquarters. But the principle created ambiguity. How much deviation was acceptable? Which circumstances justified violating doctrine? And how should officers respond when violations succeeded but still technically violated regulations? These questions had no clear answers. They depended on context, judgment, and whether the violation produced success or disaster. Kline's smoke deception had worked. If it had failed, if German forces had recognized the ruse and slaughtered his platoon during the retreat, the same action might have resulted in court-martial for wasting ammunition and getting men killed through unauthorized experimentation. The ambiguity meant that American tactical adaptation happened through informal networks rather than official channels. Successful innovations like Kline's smoke deception spread company to company through battlefield gossip. Here's what worked for us, rather than through updated field manuals and training programs. Officers quietly declined to punish violations that succeeded, creating unofficial permission for initiative without officially changing doctrine. The system was messy, inconsistent, and depended heavily on individual judgment. But it allowed American forces to adapt faster than doctrinal revision processes permitted. Soldiers fighting in July learned from innovations developed in June, passing tactical lessons through informal channels while official doctrine remained unchanged. Kline's smoke deception represented that adaptive process. His violation would never appear in field manuals as authorized procedure. But soldiers who heard about it would remember the lesson. Sometimes saving lives required breaking rules, and American military culture valued results over procedural compliance when the two conflicted. The 60mm mortar M19A1 smoke shell that Kline's team fired contained approximately 6.5 ounces of hexachloroethane smoke mixture, a chemical compound designated HC in military nomenclature. When the shell's impact fuse detonated, it ignited the HC mixture, which burned for 90 to 120 seconds, producing dense white smoke through chemical reaction. The chemistry was elegant. Hexachloroethane combined with zinc oxide created zinc chloride when burned. Zinc chloride was highly volatile and hygroscopic. It absorbed moisture from air, forming microscopic droplets that created visible white clouds. The smoke was cool compared to alternatives like white phosphorus, which meant it didn't create updrafts that lifted smoke vertically. HC smoke spread horizontally, creating screening clouds that persisted for several minutes before dissipating. White phosphorus, the alternative smoke formulation, behaved differently. WP ignited spontaneously at 34 degrees Celsius when exposed to air, creating immediate thick smoke accompanied by incendiary effects. The burning phosphorus reached temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius, creating updrafts that caused smoke to pillar upward rather than spreading horizontally. WP smoke was effective for immediate screening, but dissipated faster than HC smoke. It also had secondary anti-personnel effects. Burning phosphorus fragments could set clothing and equipment on fire. American mortar crews carried both types. Standard tactical employment used HC smoke for sustained screening operations and WP for immediate concealment with added incendiary effects. The 60mm mortar could fire either type, with crews selecting ammunition based on mission requirements. In Kline's case, the mortar team had fired HC smoke shells. The irregular pattern, 3 shells impacting 15-20 yards apart across the field, created 3 discrete white clouds, rather than one continuous screen. To soldiers watching from the hedgerow, the pattern seemed random. To German defenders trained to recognize tactical signatures, it looked like something specific: armored vehicles maneuvering under concealment. Wehrmacht defensive doctrine, codified in regulations dating to 1940 and refined through years of Eastern Front combat, taught soldiers to recognize smoke patterns and respond appropriately. Static smoke screens, continuous walls of smoke, indicated artillery preparation or infantry assault coordination. Germans responded by shifting defensive fires toward likely assault routes adjacent to screened areas, assuming attackers would emerge from smoke-covered approaches. Moving smoke suggested different threats. When smoke clouds appeared sequentially in irregular patterns, doctrine interpreted it as armored vehicles maneuvering under concealment. Tanks advancing across open ground typically fired smoke shells to obscure enemy observation. Each vehicle created a discrete cloud marking its position, with sequential firing creating the irregular pattern Kline's mortar team had accidentally replicated. German anti-tank doctrine required immediate response. When smoke indicated armor movement, defenders redirected machine guns and anti-tank weapons toward the threatened sector. Infantry repositioned to establish interlocking fields of fire covering approaches from the smoke. Artillery forward observers called for defensive fires on likely tank routes. The response was automatic, drilled through training and validated through combat experience on the Eastern Front, where Soviet armor tactics frequently used smoke for concealment. The doctrinal response depended on assumptions that made tactical sense, but created exploitable vulnerabilities. Wehrmacht training assumed enemies used smoke purposefully for legitimate tactical reasons, screening attacks, obscuring movement, marking targets. German doctrine didn't anticipate enemies wasting limited smoke ammunition on feints designed to trigger defensive repositioning. The assumption was rational. Smoke shells were scarce compared to high explosive rounds. American mortar crews typically carried 15 to 20 HE shells, but only 3 or 5 smoke rounds. Wasting smoke on deception meant lacking it for legitimate screening missions. German defensive doctrine assumed American forces wouldn't deliberately expend limited resources on feints that provided no tactical benefit. Kline's improvisation exploited that assumption. By firing 3 smoke shells in an irregular pattern, he created the signature of American armor maneuvering under concealment. German defenders followed doctrine, repositioning to engage the phantom threat and concentrating defensive fire toward the smoke. The response created exactly the opportunity Kline needed, a brief window where German attention focused away from his actual retreat route. The deception worked because both sides followed their respective doctrines. American doctrine restricted smoke to coordinated missions, making German assumptions about purposeful smoke use generally valid. German doctrine required immediate response to armor signatures, making the response automatic rather than analytical. Kline's violation of American doctrine created a tactical signature that triggered predictable German doctrinal response. But the deception contained inherent risks. If German observers had seen the smoke shell's impact and recognized them as mortar rounds rather than tank-fired smoke, the ruse would have failed immediately. If German defenders had questioned why American armor was maneuvering away from German positions rather than attacking, they might have recognized the pattern as deceptive. If any German soldier had simply ignored doctrine and investigated the smoke directly, he would have discovered no tanks existed. The deception succeeded because battlefield conditions favored it. Limited visibility in bocage terrain meant German defenders couldn't observe the mortar positions that fired the shells. Combat stress and the need for immediate response prevented lengthy analysis. And German respect for American tactical doctrine made the smoke pattern believable. If Americans fired smoke, it must serve legitimate tactical purpose. Technical understanding of smoke munitions revealed why the improvisation worked mechanically. HC smoke created persistent screening that lasted long enough for Kline's platoon to move 200 yards. The irregular pattern replicated armor signatures German doctrine trained defenders to recognize. The smoke's chemistry, cool, spreading horizontally, absorbing moisture from Norman summer air, created visual concealment that persisted through critical minutes of the retreat. But chemistry alone didn't save Kline's men. The deception succeeded because it exploited the intersection of technical capabilities and doctrinal expectations. Kline used smoke's physical properties to create visual signatures that triggered predictable enemy responses based on German tactical doctrine. The innovation wasn't inventing new smoke technology. It was recognizing how existing capabilities could be employed in ways doctrine never anticipated to exploit enemy assumptions about how those capabilities would be used. The lesson extended beyond smoke tactics. Every weapon, every piece of equipment, every tactical capability carried assumptions about proper employment. Doctrine codified those assumptions into standardized procedures. But creative soldiers who understood both the technical capabilities and enemy doctrinal expectations could sometimes achieve effects by violating their own doctrine in ways that exploited enemy doctrine's predictability. The risk was enormous. Violating doctrine without understanding why usually produced disasters. But when improvisation succeeded, it demonstrated that tactical innovation could emerge from understanding systems well enough to deliberately break them for strategic advantage. The story reached Company B, 29th Infantry Division on July 21st, 3 days after Kline's escape. Lieutenant Thomas Werner heard it third hand. A sergeant from 2nd Infantry Division had talked to someone who knew Kline's platoon. The details were vague, but the core concept was clear. Smoke shells fired in irregular patterns could fool Germans into thinking American armor was maneuvering under concealment. Werner's company was pinned down 2 miles west of St. Lo. German machine guns commanded their approach route. Communications with the battalion had failed. The company needed to disengage and reach an alternate position, but retreating under fire across open ground would cost casualties they couldn't afford. Werner ordered his mortar section to fire 4 smoke shells in a staggered pattern toward the German left flank. The mortarmen looked confused but executed the order. 4 white clouds bloomed across the field, creating the irregular signature of vehicles on the move. German fire redirected. Werner pulled his company back through a sunken lane, while Germans concentrated on the phantom threat. It worked. Company B reached the alternate position with 2 wounded. Werner filed his after-action report mentioning the smoke tactic without providing details about where he'd learned it or whether it violated doctrine. Similar stories emerged across 1st U.S. Army in late July 1944. A platoon from 4th Infantry Division used smoke to simulate an attack from the east while actually assaulting from the south. A company from 9th Infantry Division created fake armor movements to draw German anti-tank guns away from actual Sherman tank advance. Some improvisations succeeded brilliantly, saving lives and enabling tactical maneuvers that conventional methods couldn't achieve. But not every attempt worked. On July 26th, a lieutenant from 35th Infantry Division attempted the smoke deception during a retreat. His mortar team fired 3 shells in irregular pattern, replicating Kline's technique. But the German defenders were Panzer Grenadiers, mechanized infantry who'd fought on the Eastern Front and had extensive experience with Soviet armor tactics. They recognized immediately that the smoke pattern didn't match actual tank movements. Real armor fired smoke while moving, creating continuous trails. Static mortar-fired smoke created discrete clouds. The German squad leader ignored the smoke and maintained fire on the retreating Americans. The lieutenant's platoon took heavy casualties crossing exposed terrain, while German fire remained concentrated on their actual position. The improvisation had failed because the enemy recognized the deception. The tactic's effectiveness depended on specific conditions. It worked when German defenders had limited intelligence about American positions, when visibility prevented direct observation of smoke sources, and when defenders followed doctrine automatically rather than analyzing the tactical situation. It failed when experienced troops recognized inconsistencies, when German observers could see mortar positions firing smoke, or when defenders questioned why Americans would maneuver armor in directions that made no tactical sense. By early August 1944, the tactic had spread widely enough that ammunition resupply became problematic. Ordnance officers noted increased demand for smoke shells. Mortar crews requested twice the normal allocation of smoke ammunition. But supply priorities remained unchanged. High explosive shells took precedence because they directly destroyed enemy positions. Smoke was secondary. Mortar sections that relied on smoke deception found themselves rationing the few rounds they received. Some units traded with adjacent companies, swapping HE shells for smoke. Others improvised by mixing smoke with white phosphorus grenades thrown by hand to create localized screening. The proliferation of the tactic consumed finite resources faster than supply chains could adapt. More concerning, German after-action reports began documenting American smoke deceptions. A captured Wehrmacht intelligence summary from early August 1944 warned, American forces increasingly employ smoke munitions for deceptive purposes. Smoke patterns suggesting armor movement may be false signatures intended to trigger repositioning. Defend existing positions unless smoke is accompanied by visible armor or confirmed radio intelligence. The warning spread through German defensive units in Normandy. By mid-August, some German troops no longer automatically repositioned based on smoke patterns alone. They waited for confirmation. Engine sounds, vehicle silhouettes, infantry advancing alongside armor, before assuming smoke indicated genuine armor threats. The tactical innovation that had saved Kline's platoon was losing effectiveness as German forces adapted. The cycle of innovation and counter-adaptation that characterized warfare throughout history was playing out in compressed time frame. An improvisation developed in mid-July was becoming less effective by mid-August as enemies recognized the pattern and adjusted their responses. American officers monitoring the situation faced strategic questions. Should smoke deception be formally incorporated into doctrine before it became completely ineffective? Or would formalizing it accelerate German adaptation by confirming the tactic through captured field manuals? Should ammunition allocation shift to provide more smoke shells to units employing the tactic? Or would that divert resources from proven methods that delivered more consistent results? The proliferation also created problems with coordination. When multiple units employed smoke deception without coordinating, the cumulative effect could be confusion rather than successful deception. Adjacent companies firing smoke simultaneously created ambiguous signatures that didn't match any doctrinal pattern German or American. The lack of formal procedures meant no coordination mechanism existed beyond informal communication between units that might or might not have functioning radios. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Reeder, reviewing after-action reports for 2nd Infantry Division in August 1944, noted the challenge. Smoke deception tactics demonstrate both the value of junior leader initiative and the risks of widespread improvisation without doctrinal framework. Success rate appears approximately 60% when conditions favor deception, but failures result in unnecessary casualties and wasted ammunition. Formal guidance required. But developing formal guidance required time. American forces fighting in Normandy didn't have. The tactical situation evolved daily. What worked in hedgerow fighting might not work in more open terrain as Allied forces broke out toward Paris. And formalizing improvisation risked destroying the very flexibility that made it effective. The ability of junior leaders to adapt tactics to immediate situations faster than bureaucratic processes could codify procedures. The smoke deception tactic existed in tactical limbo through August 1944. Widely practiced but unofficially authorized, sometimes effective but increasingly countered by German adaptation, spreading through informal networks while official doctrine remained silent. The innovation that began with one sergeant's violation of field manual procedures had become a phenomenon that armies struggled to categorize. Neither officially sanctioned nor explicitly forbidden, neither universally successful nor completely ineffective, neither secret tactical advantage nor widely known technique German forces had learned to counter. Major Richard Hayes sat in his battalion headquarters tent on August 12, 1944, reviewing after-action reports from 3 weeks of hedgerow fighting. One report caught his attention. Company G, 2nd Battalion, had escaped a German ambush on July 18th through unauthorized use of smoke munitions. The company's commander, Lieutenant Harrison, had submitted detailed account of Staff Sergeant Kline's improvisation. Hayes understood the institutional dilemma immediately. By the letter of Field Manual 23-85, Kline had violated doctrine. He'd employed smoke munitions without authorization for purposes not covered by approved tactical procedures. Under strict interpretation, the violation warranted disciplinary action, potentially court-martial depending on how aggressively superior officers chose to enforce regulations. But the violation had saved over 100 men. Hayes reviewed other reports. Similar improvisations appeared across multiple battalions. Lieutenants ordering unauthorized smoke employment. Sergeants directing mortar teams to fire deceptive patterns. NCOs improvising tactics that doctrine never addressed. The pattern was widespread enough to suggest systemic phenomenon rather than isolated incidents. The question facing Hayes and officers like him across 1st U.S. Army was how to respond institutionally. Maintaining military discipline required consistent enforcement of regulations. If sergeants could ignore doctrine whenever they judged it inappropriate, command authority would erode. Units would devolve into collections of individuals making independent decisions, rather than coordinated forces following standardized procedures. But rigid enforcement would discourage exactly the kind of initiative that was saving lives. Kline had recognized that waiting for proper authorization meant watching his men die. His decision to violate doctrine came from sound tactical judgment in circumstances where following procedures would have produced disaster. Punishing him would signal to other junior leaders that following regulations mattered more than achieving mission success or protecting their soldiers. Hayes wasn't alone in wrestling with the question. At regimental and divisional levels, senior officers reviewed similar reports and confronted the same dilemma. The institutional response would set precedent for how the Army balanced discipline against initiative, hierarchy against adaptation, and procedural compliance against battlefield effectiveness. Colonel James Thompson, commanding 2nd Infantry Division's artillery, convened a meeting of battalion commanders in late August to address the issue. His guidance reflected pragmatic compromise rather than doctrinal purity. We will not pursue disciplinary action against officers or NCOs who employed smoke for tactical deception when communications were severed. Coordination was impossible, and immediate action was required to preserve the force. However, future smoke employment must follow proper procedures whenever feasible. Document all deviations from doctrine with detailed explanation of circumstances. The guidance created gray zone rather than clear policy. It acknowledged that doctrine sometimes failed to address battlefield realities, while maintaining that doctrine remained binding under normal circumstances. It granted junior leaders authority to violate regulations when necessary, but required them to justify those violations through after-action documentation. The approach was characteristically American, pragmatic, results-oriented, and willing to bend formal rules when circumstances demanded flexibility. Investigation into Kline's specific case revealed a broader pattern. Major Hayes interviewed Lieutenant Harrison, who provided context about the ambush, the failed communications, and the absence of alternatives. Hayes reviewed the tactical situation and concluded that Kline's decision, while violating doctrine, demonstrated sound judgment under pressure. No disciplinary action was warranted. But Hayes went further. He drafted training guidance for battalion mortar sections addressing improvisational smoke tactics in small unit operations. The guidance didn't formally authorize smoke deception. That would require changes to field manuals beyond battalion authority, but it acknowledged that situations arose where standard procedures didn't apply, and junior leaders required latitude to adapt. The guidance noted, smoke munitions may be employed for purposes not explicitly covered by FM 2380 when tactical situation demands immediate action. Coordination with higher headquarters is impossible due to communications failure, and leader judges that unauthorized employment offers best chance of mission success or force preservation. Such employment carries inherent risk and requires detailed justification in after-action reporting. Similar guidance emerged from other divisions. The institutional response was emerging through distributed decision-making rather than centralized policy change. Field-grade officers across 1st U.S. Army were independently reaching similar conclusions. Punishing successful improvisation would undermine combat effectiveness more than tolerating occasional doctrine violations. The approach reflected deeper aspect of American military culture. Unlike Wehrmacht forces, where deviation from orders typically resulted in severe punishment, or Red Army forces, where unauthorized initiative could mean execution, American forces granted junior leaders significant latitude. The cultural assumption was that sergeants and lieutenants closest to tactical situations possessed information and perspective that colonels and generals lacked. Trusting junior leaders to make sound decisions despite violating doctrine was feature rather than bug of American command philosophy. But the trust wasn't unlimited. Officers distinguished between intelligent adaptation and reckless disregard for procedures. Kline's improvisation succeeded because it exploited enemy doctrine through creative application of available resources. A sergeant who violated doctrine recklessly, wasting ammunition on ineffective schemes, or endangering his men through poor judgment, would face punishment. The distinction was success and sound judgment versus failure and carelessness. The ambiguity created challenges for future commanders. When was doctrine binding and when could it be ignored? How much risk was acceptable in improvised tactics? What level of success justified previous violations? The questions had no universal answers. They depended on context, judgment, and whether the outcome validated the decision. By September 1944, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and advanced toward Germany, the smoke deception tactic had become accepted practice without ever being formally authorized. Training guidance mentioned it vaguely. Officers tolerated its use within limits. But Field Manual 23-85 remained unchanged, still restricting smoke to coordinated missions and making no mention of tactical deception. The institutional response revealed how armies adapted in practice faster than doctrine adapted in theory. Official procedures changed slowly through bureaucratic review processes. But battlefield innovation spread rapidly through informal networks and permissive command culture that valued results over procedural compliance. The gap between official doctrine and actual practice became space where tactical evolution occurred, sanctioned through quiet tolerance rather than formal authorization. Kline never faced court-martial. He received no commendation either. His improvisation existed in an institutional gray zone, neither officially punished nor officially praised, neither forbidden nor authorized, neither unique innovation nor standard procedure. The ambiguity was uncomfortable but functional. It allowed the Army to benefit from junior leader initiative without formally endorsing violations of established doctrine, maintaining discipline while permitting adaptation, and preserving hierarchical authority while acknowledging that sergeants sometimes knew better than field manuals. 75 years after Staff Sergeant Kline fired 3 smoke shells south of St. Lo, military historians examining American tactical success in Normandy reached surprising conclusion. The hedgerow fighting succeeded not because American forces possessed superior weapons or overwhelming numbers. German defenders often inflicted higher casualties than they suffered. Success came from institutional willingness to learn from junior leaders who violated doctrine to survive. The pattern repeated across American operations in Double Wire. From North African desert to Italian mountains to Norman bocage to German forests, sergeants and lieutenants improvised solutions to tactical problems that official doctrine never anticipated. And critically, American officers at battalion and regimental level learned from those improvisations rather than punishing them. The institutional learning took time. Changes to formal doctrine required bureaucratic processes that moved slower than battlefield adaptation. Field manual revisions published in 1945 and 1946 incorporated some lessons from Normandy, but the fundamental shift happened more gradually over subsequent decades as Army doctrine writers systematically analyzed what had worked and why. FM 7-8, Infantry Rifle Platoon and Squad, published in April 1992 and revised through 2001, explicitly incorporated language that would have validated Kline's decision. Generally accepted does not mean that doctrine should be applied uniformly on all missions. Leaders use their own standing operating procedures and judgment to determine what is appropriate based on the specific mission, enemy, terrain, troops time, civil conditions. The manual successor, FM 3-21.8, 2007, went further. One of the defining characteristics of war is chaos. Tactics, techniques, and procedures are the counterweight to this chaos. From the moment combat begins, plans often become obsolete, communications fail, soldiers become casualties, and units fragment. The language directly addressed the gap between doctrine and battlefield reality that Kline's improvisation had exposed. It validated what hedgerow veterans had learned. Doctrine provided framework, but battlefield conditions often demanded deviation from prescribed techniques. Leaders closest to tactical situations possessed information and perspective that doctrine writers couldn't anticipate. The cultural shift was profound. Post-war American military doctrine explicitly encouraged initiative over rigid compliance. The principle became formalized as mission command, a philosophy emphasizing decentralized decision-making, where commanders communicated intent and left execution methods to subordinate leaders' judgment. Mission command doctrine traced directly to double-ass point experiences where survival depended on junior leaders adapting faster than enemies could counter. The principle was articulated clearly in modern manuals. Commanders define what needs to be accomplished and why, but subordinates determine how based on conditions that doctrine couldn't predict. The approach contrasted sharply with more rigid command structures. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized detailed orders and strict compliance. Soviet doctrine centralized tactical decisions at levels that prevented junior leaders from adapting to immediate conditions. Both systems sacrificed flexibility for control, producing forces that performed well when conditions matched doctrine, but struggled when unexpected situations demanded improvisation. American military culture's tolerance for controlled deviation from doctrine became strategic advantage. Armies that empowered junior leaders to improvise adapted faster than enemies could develop countermeasures. The cycle of innovation and counter-innovation that characterized warfare throughout history favored organizations that learned from bottom-up experimentation rather than relying exclusively on top-down planning. Kline's smoke trick exemplified the principle. His improvisation exploited enemy doctrine by creating tactical signature that triggered predictable German response. The innovation didn't come from superior weapons or sophisticated planning. It came from sergeant under pressure who understood both his available capabilities and enemy doctrinal assumptions well enough to create deception that violated his own doctrine to exploit theirs. The lesson extended beyond smoke tactics. Every piece of equipment, every tactical capability, every doctrinal procedure carried assumptions about proper employment. Creative soldiers who understood both technical capabilities and enemy expectations could sometimes achieve effects that doctrine never anticipated. But such creativity required organizational culture that valued initiative over compliance when the two conflicted. American willingness to learn from violations rather than automatically punishing them enabled tactical evolution that more rigid systems couldn't match. Improvisations that succeeded spread through informal networks, sergeant to sergeant, company to company, faster than formal doctrine, could be updated. Officers who quietly declined to punish effective violations created permission for initiative without officially changing regulations. The system was messy and inconsistent. It depended on individual judgment about when violations represented intelligent adaptation versus reckless disregard for procedures. It created ambiguity about boundaries between acceptable initiative and unacceptable insubordination. But it worked. American forces in Double adapted tactically faster than enemies who followed more rigid doctrinal systems. The principle endured through subsequent conflicts. Vietnam, Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq, American tactical doctrine consistently emphasized junior leader initiative and decentralized decision-making. The language varied, but the concept remained. Soldiers closest to tactical situations possessed information that higher commanders lacked, and empowering them to adapt based on battlefield conditions produced better outcomes than rigid hierarchical control. Modern military professionals studying mission command principle often trace its origins to German Auftragstaktik doctrine developed in 19th century. But American implementation differed fundamentally. German mission tactics operated within highly disciplined framework where deviation from commander's intent was punished severely. American mission command granted broader latitude for improvisation, tolerating violations that succeeded while maintaining discipline through outcome assessment rather than procedural compliance. Kline's story became one of thousands of similar incidents that collectively shaped American military culture. Most went undocumented. A sergeant here, a lieutenant there, improvising solutions that saved lives and accomplished missions through methods no field manual prescribed. The individual stories mattered less than the cumulative pattern they created. An institutional culture that trusted soldiers to solve problems doctrine writers never anticipated. The legacy revealed deeper truth about military effectiveness. Superior outcomes came not just from better equipment or superior training, but from organizational cultures that balanced discipline with flexibility, hierarchy with initiative, and standardization with adaptation. Armies needed doctrine to provide framework and ensure coordination, but they also needed leaders at every level who understood that doctrine was tool, not law, guidance for typical situations, not rigid prescription for every circumstance. Staff Sergeant Kline never became famous. His improvisation didn't appear in field manuals as authorized procedure. But the principle his violation exemplified, that sometimes saving lives requires breaking rules, and wise institutions learn from violations rather than punishing them, became foundational to American tactical doctrine. The smoke trick saved over 100 men in one hedgerow field south of St. Lo. The principle it illustrated has influenced American military culture for 8 decades, shaping how armies think about doctrine, initiative, adaptation, and the fundamental question of whether soldiers serve procedures or procedures serve soldiers. Sometimes the best doctrine, history demonstrated, is knowing when to ignore it.